Today, there are over 8 billion humans living on Earth. Most of us wake up in buildings made of concrete and steel, surrounded by streets full of cars connected to the internet, buying food grown by strangers thousands of miles away. We live in cities with millions of people, work in offices, shop in supermarkets. This is normal life. This is how humans live. But if you had looked at the world 12,000 years ago, the picture would have been shockingly different. There were no cities. None. Not one permanent settlement with more than a few hundred people on the entire planet. No farms, no writing, no governments, no money. Just small bands of humans wandering across vast landscapes, hunting animals and gathering plants, living the same way their ancestors had for hundreds of thousands of years. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So, subscribe maybe and tell me where you are and what time. I check comments and it's like Berlin at breakfast, Boston at bedtime, all at once. You know that feeling when you realize how different your life could have been? Like when you think about all the choices that led you to where you are now. That's what happened to our entire species. Except the choice wasn't made by individuals. It was made by climate, by chance, by the gradual accumulation of small innovations that nobody at the time realized would change everything. And here's the really crazy part. The transition from this ancient way of life to agriculture and cities happened so recently that if human history was a 24-hour day, we've only been living in permanent settlements for about the last 17 minutes. For 99.9% of human existence, we lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers. No permanent homes, no stored food lasting more than a few days, no possessions that couldn't be carried, no specialization beyond the basic division of labor between men, women, and different age groups. It was a world so alien to modern experience that most people can't even imagine what daily life was actually like. But archaeologists, anthropologists, and climate scientists have been piecing together the evidence for decades, and the picture they've revealed is absolutely fascinating. This is the story of the last great nomadic age, the final chapter of the old world, the end of a way of life that had sustained humanity since the beginning. The world in 10,000 BCE was a very different place. The ice sheets that had covered much of North America and Europe were finally retreating after the last glacial maximum 20,000 years earlier. But they were retreating slowly, leaving behind a landscape that was still largely shaped by ice and cold. Most of northern Europe was tundra. Vast grasslands stretched across what would become France, Germany, and Poland. Where London sits today, there were herds of reindeer and mammoths. The English Channel didn't exist yet. Britain and Ireland were connected to the mainland by a land bridge that wouldn't be flooded by rising seas for another 2,000 years. North America was even more dramatically different. Ice sheets a mile thick still covered much of Canada and the northern United States. The Great Lakes didn't exist in their current form. What would become New York City was buried under hundreds of feet of ice. But in the ice-free zones, life was abundant in ways that are hard to imagine today. The grasslands supported enormous herds of megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave bears, Irish elk with antler spans of 12 feet. Animals that seem mythological to us were everyday reality for our ancestors. And scattered across this landscape, in tiny groups of 20 to 50 people, were the last purely nomadic humans on Earth. These weren't primitive people struggling to survive. By 10,000 BCE, modern humans had been perfecting the hunter-gatherer lifestyle for tens of thousands of years. They had developed sophisticated technologies, complex social systems, and detailed knowledge of their environments that would put modern survivalists to shame. But their way of life was about to end forever, and nobody saw it coming. Let's start with a day in the life. It's early spring, 10,000 BCE, somewhere in what will eventually become central France. You're part of a band of about 35 people, 3 extended families who travel together through territories that span hundreds of square miles. You wake up as the sky begins to lighten, not because you have anywhere specific to be, but because human circadian rhythms are calibrated to natural light cycles. There are no artificial lights, no reason to stay up late, no appointments to keep. Your sleep patterns follow the sun and the seasons. You're sleeping in a temporary shelter, not a tent as we'd recognize it, but a framework of wooden poles covered with animal hides that can be assembled and disassembled in less than an hour. Everything your people own must be portable. There are no permanent structures anywhere on Earth except for a few seasonal camps used year after year. The first person awake is usually someone from the older generation. Not because they need less sleep, but because they're the keepers of knowledge about weather patterns, animal behavior, plant cycles. They wake early to read the landscape, to smell the air, to listen for subtle changes that might indicate where the group should move next. This morning, there's a smell of rain coming from the west, and the wind patterns suggest it might last several days. This is crucial information. Your group's survival depends on staying ahead of weather systems, on knowing where to find shelter during storms, on understanding how rain will affect animal movements and plant growth. By the time you're fully awake, someone has already rekindled the fire from last night's coals. Fire is never allowed to die completely. Carrying fire from camp to camp, keeping embers alive during travel, is one of the most important responsibilities in the group. Losing fire means days of labor trying to restart it with friction methods, and in cold or wet weather, losing fire can mean death. The fire isn't just for warmth and cooking, it's the center of social life, the place where the group gathers to share food, make plans, tell stories, teach children. Archaeological evidence shows that human social evolution is intimately connected to the control of fire. The ability to extend the day with artificial light created the first truly social spaces in human history. Around the fire, the day's plans emerge through informal discussion, not formal decision-making as we'd recognize it. Hunter-gatherer groups are remarkably egalitarian. Nobody has absolute authority over anyone else. Decisions emerge through consensus, with different people taking leadership roles depending on the situation. Today, the hunters in the group have been tracking a herd of reindeer for 3 days. The animals are moving north as the weather warms, following ancient migration routes that the hunters know by heart. But the herd is moving faster than usual, possibly because wolves have been following them. The plant specialists in the group, mostly women but including some men, have been monitoring the early spring growth in this area. The first edible shoots are appearing and there are signs that root vegetables survived the winter in good condition, but to properly harvest them, the group would need to stay in this location for at least a week. This creates a decision point that nomadic groups face constantly: follow the animals or exploit the plants. You can't do both effectively, and the choice will determine where you'll be living and what you'll be eating for the next several weeks. The discussion isn't heated or formal. It's the kind of easy conversation that happens when people have been making these kinds of decisions together for years. Someone mentions that the reindeer herd is large this year, that a successful hunt could provide meat for weeks. Someone else points out that plant foods are more reliable, that following herds is always risky. An older member of the group, someone who has lived through many cycles of abundance and scarcity, mentions that this location has been good to your people in the past. That staying here might provide opportunities to meet up with allied bands, to trade for materials that your group needs, possibly to arrange marriages for the young adults. This is one of the hidden complexities of nomadic life that most people don't think about. Hunter-gatherer groups can't survive in isolation. They need to maintain relationships with dozens of other bands across enormous territories. Young people need to find marriage partners outside their immediate family group. Rare materials like high-quality stone for tools need to be traded across hundreds of miles. The constant movement of nomadic life isn't random wandering. It's a carefully choreographed dance designed to maintain these complex social and economic networks while also efficiently exploiting natural resources. After about an hour of discussion, consensus emerges. The group will split temporarily. Most of the hunters will follow the reindeer herd north, while the rest of the band stays here to harvest plants and prepare for a potential meeting with allied groups. This isn't unusual. Nomadic bands split and reunite constantly, adjusting their size and composition to match available resources and opportunities. Flexibility is everything in this lifestyle. By mid-morning, the hunting party has departed, carrying minimal gear, weapons, basic tools, materials for making temporary shelters. They'll be gone for anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks, depending on how the hunt goes. Meanwhile, the rest of the group begins the systematic exploitation of local plant resources. This isn't casual foraging, it's sophisticated resource management based on detailed ecological knowledge accumulated over thousands of years. The plant specialists know which species are ready for harvest, which ones need more time to mature, which ones can be safely gathered in large quantities without depleting future yields. They know how to process toxic plants to make them edible, how to preserve foods for later consumption, how to use different plant materials for tools, medicines, and dyes. Modern hunter-gatherers, the few who still exist, typically know the properties of several hundred plant species in their territories. They can identify plants by their leaves, roots, bark, flowers, or seeds. They know which parts are edible and when, which ones have medicinal properties, which ones can be used for making tools or shelter materials. This knowledge represents one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements. It was accumulated slowly over thousands of generations, tested through trial and error, refined through careful observation. It was passed down through oral traditions that were more precise and comprehensive than most written texts, and by 10,000 BCE, this knowledge was reaching its peak. Humans had been perfecting the hunter-gatherer lifestyle for so long that they had become incredibly efficient at extracting resources from natural environments. Archaeological evidence suggests that hunter-gatherer groups in many regions were living better than the early agricultural peoples who would replace them. They were taller, healthier, had better nutrition, worked fewer hours per day, and had more leisure time, but they were also living at the limits of what the hunter-gatherer lifestyle could support. By 10,000 BCE, human populations had grown large enough that really good territories were becoming crowded. The megafauna that had provided easy hunting for thousands of years were starting to disappear, partly due to climate change, partly due to human hunting pressure. Competition between groups was intensifying. Archaeological sites from this period show increasing evidence of conflict, defensive positions, weapons designed for warfare rather than hunting. The old world was sustainable, but it wasn't indefinitely expandable, and expansion was exactly what human populations needed. Back to your group, harvesting plants in the spring landscape. The work is systematic and social. Adults gather in small teams, sharing knowledge about the best locations and techniques. Children accompany the adults, learning through observation and hands-on practice. There's no formal education in hunter-gatherer societies, but the learning process is constant and comprehensive. Children learn by doing, by imitating, by asking questions. By adolescence, they know as much about their environment as most modern people know about their jobs. The plant harvesting provides immediate returns. Fresh shoots and early roots add variety to a diet that has been heavy on stored meat and fat through the winter. But the work also serves social functions. Gathering activities create opportunities for informal conversations, for sharing gossip about other groups, for making plans for the summer months. As the day progresses, news arrives that changes everything. A messenger from a neighboring band appears with information that will reshape your group's plans for the next several months. Messengers in nomadic societies aren't formal institutions. They're individuals traveling between groups for personal reasons who carry news as a social courtesy. This messenger is a young woman returning to her birth group after spending 2 years with her husband's people. She's traveling alone, which tells you something about the safety and social organization of this world. A lone individual can move across hundreds of miles of territory, confident of receiving hospitality and protection from any human group she encounters. The news she carries is both exciting and troubling. Exciting because she's seen evidence of an unusually large mammoth herd moving through the region, animals whose hunting could provide enough food for dozens of bands. Troubling because other groups are already mobilizing to intercept the herd, and some of those groups have been hostile to your people in recent years. This creates the kind of decision that defines nomadic life: opportunity balanced against risk, potential abundance weighed against possible conflict. Mammoth hunting in 10,000 BCE was one of the most complex and dangerous activities humans engaged in. A single mammoth could provide several tons of meat, enough to feed a large group for weeks. The hide could be used for shelter materials. The bones could be carved into tools. The fat could be rendered and stored as a high-energy food source for lean times. But mammoths were enormously dangerous to hunt. A mature mammoth stood 11 feet tall and weighed 6 tons. They had tusks that could impale a human with a single swipe, and they lived in herds protected by dominant males who would charge anything perceived as a threat. Successful mammoth hunting required coordination between multiple bands, sophisticated planning, specialized weapons, and techniques that took years to master. It was one of the few activities that regularly brought together large numbers of people from different groups. These mammoth hunting aggregations were some of the largest gatherings of humans that occurred in the pre-agricultural world. Sometimes 200 or 300 people would come together for a few weeks, creating temporary communities larger than any permanent settlement that existed at the time. These gatherings served multiple purposes beyond hunting. They were opportunities for trade, for arranging marriages, for sharing news and knowledge, for resolving conflicts between groups. They were the closest thing to cities that existed in the nomadic world. But they were also potential sources of conflict. Competition for the best hunting positions, disputes over how to divide the meat, old grievances between groups that hadn't seen each other for months or years. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of these gatherings ended in violence. The messenger's news forces your group to make a choice that will determine your fate for the rest of the year. Join the mammoth hunt and risk conflict with hostile groups, or avoid the hunt and miss an opportunity that might not come again for years. The discussion that follows is more intense than the morning's casual planning. This decision affects everyone in the group and has consequences that could last for generations. The hunters who went after the reindeer herd are recalled through a system of signals, smoke fires in prearranged patterns that can be seen for miles, calls that carry across the landscape, markers left in prominent locations. Within 2 days, the full group is reunited and debating their options. The arguments for joining the mammoth hunt are compelling. Food security is never guaranteed in nomadic life. A successful hunt could provide enough stored meat and fat to last through the next winter, even if other food sources fail. The social benefits are equally important. Participating in a major hunt strengthens alliances with other groups, creates opportunities for young people to find marriage partners, provides access to trade goods and raw materials that aren't available locally, but the risks are real too. The hostile groups mentioned by the messenger aren't just competitors, they're enemies. 3 years ago, a dispute over hunting territories led to violence that killed several people on both sides. The survivors are still seeking revenge. Joining the mammoth hunt means potential combat with well-armed, experienced fighters. It means risking the lives of the group's most capable hunters, the people on whom everyone else depends for survival. The debate continues for days, with different perspectives emerging as people process the implications. Older members of the group who remember previous conflicts urge caution. Younger hunters, eager to prove themselves and gain status, push for participation. Women with children worry about the risks, but also about the consequences of missing such a major opportunity. Finally, consensus emerges around a compromise solution that reflects the sophisticated strategic thinking of nomadic peoples. The group will send a small delegation to the mammoth hunt, enough people to maintain relationships with allied bands and claim a share of any successful hunt, but not so many that the group would be devastated if things go wrong. The delegation will include the group's best hunters and most skilled diplomats. They'll carry gifts for allied groups and trade goods that might help diffuse tensions with hostile ones. Most importantly, they'll carry information about the group's location and plans so that other bands know where to find them if further cooperation becomes possible. This solution reflects one of the key characteristics of successful nomadic societies: the ability to balance risk and opportunity, to make decisions that optimize outcomes across multiple timescales and scenarios. The delegation departs, and the remaining group members settle in for an extended stay in their current location. This provides an opportunity to engage in activities that require more time and stability than nomadic life usually allows. Tool-making becomes a major focus. The group's stone knapper, a middle-aged man who learned the craft from his father and grandfather, begins producing the specialized points needed for mammoth hunting. These aren't simple arrowheads, they're sophisticated composite tools, stone points hafted to wooden shafts with complex bindings that allow them to penetrate thick mammoth hide without breaking. Each point takes hours to make, and the napper might produce only a few dozen in a month. But these tools represent thousands of years of technological development. The stoneworking techniques were refined through countless generations of experimentation. The hafting methods were perfected through trial and error. The design of the points reflects detailed knowledge of mammoth anatomy and behavior. This is high technology, 10,000 BCE style. Tools so sophisticated and effective that they wouldn't be significantly improved upon until the invention of metal weapons thousands of years later. Meanwhile, other group members focus on different specialties. The hide workers prepare materials for the upcoming summer travels, processing skins into the various forms needed for clothing, shelter, and storage containers. The cordage specialists twist plant fibers into ropes and nets. The firekeepers prepare traveling hearths that will keep embers alive during movement. Children participate in all these activities, learning through imitation and practice. By the age of 12, most children in hunter-gatherer societies have mastered basic versions of all the technologies their culture depends on. By adulthood, everyone can make tools, process foods, construct shelters, navigate across featureless terrain, track animals, identify plants, predict weather patterns. This level of universal competence is remarkable by modern standards. Every adult in a nomadic group possesses skills that would take modern people years to learn, if they could learn them at all. But this competence comes at a cost. The technologies are sophisticated within their domains, but the domains are limited. Hunter-gatherer tools are incredibly well adapted for hunting, gathering, and processing natural materials. But they can't be scaled up for large-scale production. They can't be used to transform landscapes. They can't support large permanent settlements. The lifestyle that had sustained humanity for hundreds of thousands of years was approaching its natural limits, and the alternatives were just beginning to emerge. 3 weeks after the delegation departed, they return with news that will reshape the group's understanding of the changing world. The mammoth hunt had been successful beyond anyone's expectations. 3 mammoths were killed, providing enough meat to feed all the participating groups for months. But more importantly, the hunting aggregation had revealed changes happening across the region that nobody fully understood. Several groups reported that the large game animals were becoming less predictable in their movements. Herds that had followed the same migration routes for generations were suddenly changing course. Animals were appearing in unexpected locations and disappearing from traditional hunting grounds. Plant foods were changing too. Some species that had been reliable for thousands of years were becoming scarce. Others, previously rare or unknown, were appearing in large quantities in new locations. The climate was shifting, but in subtle ways that were difficult to interpret. Rainfall patterns were changing. Growing seasons were becoming longer in some areas, shorter in others. Winter temperatures were less predictable. Most puzzling of all, several groups had encountered evidence of settled human communities. Not nomadic camps, but permanent structures, food storage facilities, signs that people were staying in one place for months or even years at a time. These reports were almost impossible to believe. Humans had been nomadic for so long that the idea of permanent settlement seemed absurd. Where would you get food if you couldn't move to follow resources? How would you maintain social relationships with other groups if you were tied to one location? What would you do when local resources were exhausted? But the reports were too consistent to dismiss. Something fundamental was changing in the way humans lived, and your group needed to understand what it meant for your own survival. The delegation had also returned with trade goods that provided clues about these larger changes. Stone tools made from raw materials that came from hundreds of miles away, indicating trade networks more extensive than anything previously known. Ornamental objects that suggested craft specialization beyond anything seen in traditional nomadic societies. Food items that had been processed using techniques your group had never encountered. Most intriguing of all, they brought back seeds. Not just any seeds, but varieties of wild grasses that had been selected and modified in ways that made them larger and more nutritious than their natural counterparts. The concept of deliberately modifying plant species was completely alien to traditional hunter-gatherer thinking. Plants were resources to be harvested, not things to be changed or controlled. The idea that humans could improve upon nature was revolutionary. But these seeds provided evidence that someone, somewhere, was doing exactly that. They were taking wild plants and turning them into something more useful, more productive, more reliable than natural varieties. The implications were staggering. If plants could be modified and controlled, then food production could become predictable in ways that hunting and gathering never were. Groups wouldn't need to move constantly to find resources. They could stay in one place and make the resources come to them. It was the beginning of agriculture, and nobody involved understood that they were witnessing the most important transition in human history. The group spends weeks debating what to do with this information. The traditional response to changing conditions was to adapt through mobility, to find new territories or modify existing strategies, but the changes happening now seemed too large and systematic for traditional solutions. Some members of the group argued for seeking out these settled communities, for learning their techniques and possibly adopting their lifestyle. Others insisted that the nomadic way of life had sustained humans for hundreds of thousands of years and shouldn't be abandoned lightly. The debate revealed deep philosophical differences about human nature and humanity's relationship with the natural world. Was it better to adapt to natural conditions, as nomads had always done, or to modify those conditions to serve human needs, as the settled groups seemed to be doing? These weren't just practical questions, they were questions about identity, about what it meant to be human, about humanity's proper role in the natural order. And they were questions that would be answered not through debate, but through the gradual accumulation of small decisions made by thousands of groups across multiple generations. As summer approaches, your group faces a decision that will determine their place in this changing world. Continue the traditional seasonal rounds, following resources and maintaining relationships with other nomadic groups, or investigate these new ways of living, possibly at the cost of abandoning traditions that had sustained their ancestors for millennia? The choice isn't made dramatically or finally. Like most transitions in human history, it emerges gradually through a series of small adjustments and experiments. The group decides to modify their traditional summer route to pass through territories where settled communities have been reported, not to join them permanently, but to observe, to learn, to understand what advantages this new lifestyle might offer. This decision represents a turning point not just for your group, but for human civilization itself. The investigation of agricultural communities by nomadic peoples was one of the key mechanisms through which farming spread across the world. Hunter-gatherers didn't suddenly abandon their lifestyle to become farmers. They encountered agricultural communities, observed their advantages and disadvantages, experimented with agricultural techniques while maintaining nomadic fallback strategies, and gradually adopted more settled ways of life as conditions made agriculture increasingly attractive. The process took thousands of years and involved countless individual decisions like the one your group is making. Each group that chose to investigate agricultural communities rather than avoiding them, each person who decided to experiment with plant cultivation while maintaining traditional skills, each family that chose to stay near agricultural settlements during difficult seasons rather than moving to less productive territories. The summer journey that follows is unlike any your group has undertaken before. Instead of following traditional routes optimized for hunting and gathering, you're traveling toward unknown territories guided by second-hand reports and fragmentary information. The landscape you're traveling through is itself in transition. The retreating ice sheets have left behind a world that's still adjusting to new climate patterns. Lakes are forming and disappearing as drainage patterns change. Forests are expanding into former tundra, while grasslands spread into former forest zones. The animal populations are adapting to these changes with varying success. Some species, like reindeer and Arctic foxes, are following the retreating ice northward. Others, like aurochs and red deer, are expanding their ranges as warmer conditions create new habitats. But the most dramatic changes are happening to the megafauna that had dominated the landscape for tens of thousands of years. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, cave bears, and dozens of other large species are disappearing. Some of this extinction is due to climate change. Animals adapted to Ice Age conditions are struggling to survive in the warmer, more variable climate. But human hunting pressure is also taking a toll. As human populations have grown and hunting techniques have become more sophisticated, even large animals that had survived previous climate changes are being driven to extinction. Your group encounters evidence of these extinctions as you travel. Skeletal remains of mammoths and other megafauna, some so fresh that scavengers haven't finished cleaning the bones, others old enough to be partially fossilized. Each skeleton represents not just the death of an individual animal, but the loss of a resource that human groups had depended on for thousands of years. Mammoth hunting had provided not just food, but materials for tools, shelter, and clothing. It had been the focus of some of the largest social gatherings in the nomadic world. As the megafauna disappear, the entire structure of nomadic life is becoming unsustainable. The resources that had supported small groups of mobile hunters for hundreds of thousands of years are no longer sufficient for the larger human populations that now exist. This resource crisis is one of the primary drivers pushing human groups toward agriculture. As hunting becomes less reliable, plant foods become more important. As plant foods become more important, techniques for increasing their productivity become valuable. As productivity techniques develop, permanent settlement becomes advantageous. The agricultural revolution wasn't caused by a single invention or discovery. It was a response to changing conditions that made traditional lifestyles increasingly difficult to sustain. After 2 weeks of travel, your group encounters their first agricultural settlement. It's smaller than expected, maybe 50 people living in what appear to be permanent structures near a river valley where wild grasses grow in unusual abundance. The settlement isn't impressive by later standards. The structures are simple, probably rebuilt every few years. There's no evidence of monumental architecture or craft specialization. The people look like nomads who have simply stopped moving. But the food storage facilities are remarkable. Large pits lined with stones and sealed with clay, containing enough processed grain to feed the community for months. Underground chambers filled with nuts, dried fruits, and preserved meat. Storage technologies that would allow people to survive lean periods without moving to new territories. The social dynamics of the settlement are also intriguing. The community includes people from multiple nomadic groups who have chosen to live together permanently. Marriage relationships cross traditional band boundaries. Children grow up knowing people outside their immediate family groups in ways that would be impossible in nomadic societies. But most fascinating of all are the plants themselves. The wild grasses growing near the settlement have been systematically modified through selective harvesting. The largest, most nutritious seeds have been saved and replanted year after year, gradually creating varieties that produce more food per plant than their wild ancestors. This is the beginning of plant domestication, the process that would eventually create all the crop species that modern agriculture depends on. But at this stage, it's barely distinguishable from traditional gathering practices. The people are simply being more systematic about which plants they harvest and where they scatter the seeds. The settlement's inhabitants welcome your group according to traditional hospitality customs, but the social interactions reveal the tensions inherent in the transition from nomadic to settled life. The settled people have gained food security and storage capacity, but they've lost mobility and the social connections that come with it. They know less about conditions in distant territories. They have fewer options when local resources fail. They're more vulnerable to conflicts with neighboring groups because they can't simply move away from problems. The nomadic lifestyle of your group provides flexibility and wide-ranging knowledge, but it can't match the settled community's ability to accumulate and store resources. When your group's food supplies run low, you have to find new sources immediately. The settled people can draw on stored resources for weeks or months. Both lifestyles have advantages and disadvantages, but the long-term trend is becoming clear. As environmental conditions continue to change and human populations continue to grow, the advantages of settled agriculture are becoming more significant than the advantages of nomadic hunting and gathering. Your group spends several weeks with the settlement, learning agricultural techniques and observing settled social organization. Some members of the group are attracted to the stability and food security. Others are frustrated by the restrictions on movement and the loss of connection to distant territories and peoples. The children are particularly fascinated by the settled lifestyle. For them, the idea of staying in one place long enough to see plants grow from seeds to maturity is novel and exciting. They quickly learn the basics of plant cultivation and show more enthusiasm for agricultural work than some adults in the group. This generational difference is crucial to understanding how the transition from nomadic to agricultural life actually occurred. It wasn't usually adults who made the dramatic decision to abandon nomadism for farming. It was young people who grew up during the transition period, who learned both lifestyles and who gradually shifted toward the newer way of life as circumstances made it more attractive. As autumn approaches, your group faces the decision that will define their future. Return to the traditional nomadic lifestyle for the winter, or attempt to establish their own agricultural settlement before the cold weather arrives. The decision is complicated by practical considerations. Your group doesn't have the stored food supplies necessary to survive a winter without mobility. They don't have the housing technologies needed for permanent cold weather shelter. Most importantly, they don't have secure access to the land and resources needed to support a settled community. The settled people they've been living with have spent years developing their community. They've modified the local environment to support their needs. They've established relationships with neighboring groups. They've accumulated the knowledge and resources necessary for year-round residence. Starting from scratch, especially so late in the year, would be extremely risky. Most members of the group favor returning to nomadic patterns for the winter while incorporating some of the agricultural techniques they've learned. This compromise solution reflects the pragmatic approach that most human groups took during the transition period. Rather than making dramatic either-or choices between nomadism and agriculture, they adopted mixed strategies that combined elements of both lifestyles. Your group spends the winter following traditional nomadic patterns, but with some important modifications. They carry seeds saved from the agricultural settlement, planning to experiment with cultivation during the next growing season. They've learned food processing and storage techniques that make plant foods more useful during winter months. They've established ongoing relationships with the settled community that can provide resources or refuge if traditional nomadic strategies fail. Most importantly, they've gained knowledge about the changing world that will help them make better decisions in the future. They understand that the conditions that had sustained nomadic life for thousands of years are changing. They know that alternatives exist and have some understanding of how those alternatives work. The winter is harder than usual. The disappearance of megafauna has reduced the availability of large game. Climate variability makes traditional seasonal predictions less reliable. Competition with other nomadic groups for remaining resources is intensifying. Several times during the winter, your group considers returning to the agricultural settlement, abandoning nomadism entirely in favor of the food security that settled agriculture provides. But each time, conditions improve just enough to make continued nomadism seem viable. This pattern of almost but not quite abandoning nomadism continues for several years. Your group becomes increasingly integrated into the networks of relationships between nomadic and settled peoples that are developing across the region. Sometimes they spend months with agricultural settlements, contributing labor during planting and harvest seasons in exchange for food and shelter. Sometimes they trade nomadic resources like high-quality stone tools or exotic raw materials for agricultural products. Gradually, the distinction between nomadic and settled people becomes less meaningful. Your group develops expertise in both lifestyles. They know how to hunt and gather efficiently across wide territories, but they also know how to cultivate plants and store food for long periods. This mixed economy proves to be more resilient and productive than either pure nomadism or pure agriculture. It allows people to adapt to changing conditions by shifting emphasis between different resource strategies as circumstances require. But it's also inherently unstable. The mixed lifestyle requires maintaining relationships with both nomadic and settled communities, managing complex seasonal schedules that balance different resource activities, and making constant decisions about where to invest time and energy. Over time, the advantages of settling down become increasingly apparent. Stored resources provide security during difficult periods. Permanent communities allow for craft specialization and more sophisticated technologies. Children can receive more intensive education when the community isn't constantly moving. Most importantly, agricultural settlements can support larger populations than nomadic territories. As human numbers continue to grow, nomadic areas become increasingly crowded, while agricultural areas can accommodate more people through intensified food production. 5 years after first encountering the agricultural settlement, your group makes the final transition. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, over the course of a growing season, as it becomes clear that they've spent more time in permanent locations than traveling between them. The decision isn't celebrated or mourned, It's simply recognized as the logical outcome of years of gradual adaptation to changing conditions. The nomadic lifestyle that had sustained your people for hundreds of thousands of years is finally ending, replaced by something entirely new in human experience. By 8000 BCE, most human groups in regions suitable for agriculture had made similar transitions. The world was filling up with permanent settlements, agricultural communities that would eventually grow into villages, towns, and cities. But the transformation wasn't complete or uniform. Nomadic peoples continued to exist in regions unsuitable for agriculture. Pastoral nomadism, based on herding domesticated animals rather than hunting wild ones, developed in grassland and desert regions. Some groups maintained mixed economies that combined nomadic and settled elements. The diversity of human lifestyles actually increased during the transition period as different groups adapted to different environmental conditions and opportunities. But the dominant trend was clear. Humanity was becoming a settled agricultural species. The implications of this transition were enormous, though nobody at the time could have predicted them. Agriculture made possible the accumulation of surplus resources, which enabled craft specialization, social stratification, and eventually complex political systems. Permanent settlements became the nodes around which trade networks developed, leading to the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies across vast distances. Population growth in agricultural areas created the demographic pressures that would eventually lead to territorial expansion and the spread of agricultural peoples into regions previously occupied only by nomads. Most fundamentally, agriculture changed humanity's relationship with the natural world. Instead of adapting to natural conditions, humans began modifying those conditions to serve their needs. This shift from adaptation to manipulation would eventually lead to the complete transformation of Earth's landscapes and ecosystems. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle that had shaped human evolution for hundreds of thousands of years disappeared from most of the world within just a few thousand years of agriculture's invention. By 5000 BCE, the majority of humans lived in agricultural settlements, and the nomadic way of life had become a minority adaptation to environments unsuitable for farming. But what was lost in this transition was as significant as what was gained. The knowledge systems that nomadic peoples had developed over hundreds of thousands of years began to disappear within a few generations of settling down. Detailed understanding of animal behavior, plant ecology, weather patterns, and navigation techniques that had been essential for survival became irrelevant in agricultural communities. The social structures that had sustained small nomadic groups for millennia were replaced by the hierarchical organizations necessary for managing larger settled populations. The egalitarian decision-making processes that had characterized hunter-gatherer societies gave way to more centralized leadership structures. Most importantly, the direct, intimate relationship with the natural world that had defined human existence for hundreds of thousands of years was replaced by an increasingly mediated relationship based on controlling and modifying natural processes rather than adapting to them. The last purely nomadic humans in 10,000 BCE were living at the end of an era that stretched back to the origins of our species. They carried within their cultures and their daily practices the accumulated wisdom of humanity's entire evolutionary history. When they woke up each morning to read the landscape for signs of weather and animal movements, they were practicing skills that had been refined across thousands of generations. When they gathered around fires to share knowledge and make decisions, they were participating in social processes that had sustained human communities since the development of language itself. When they moved across vast territories following seasonal resources and maintaining relationships with dozens of other groups, they were living the lifestyle that had carried humans through ice ages, climate catastrophes, and the colonization of every continent except Antarctica. They didn't know they were the last. They couldn't have imagined that within a few thousand years, most of the world would be covered with permanent settlements, that humans would number in the millions rather than thousands, that the intimate knowledge of the natural world they took for granted would become virtually extinct. They thought they were just living their lives, making the same kinds of decisions their ancestors had always made, adapting to changing conditions the way humans had always adapted. But they were actually witnessing the end of the world. Not the end of the physical world, but the end of a way of being human that had defined our species since its beginning. The transition to agriculture wasn't just a change in how humans obtained food, it was a transformation of human consciousness, of humanity's understanding of its place in the natural order, of the basic assumptions about what human life could and should be. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had seen themselves as part of nature, subject to its rhythms and cycles, dependent on understanding and adapting to natural processes they could influence but not control. Agriculture introduced the revolutionary idea that humans could improve upon nature, that natural processes could be modified and directed to serve human purposes, that the world existed primarily as a resource for human use, rather than as a system of which humans were merely one part. This shift in perspective would eventually lead to the complete transformation of Earth's surface. Forests would be cleared for farmland, rivers would be diverted for irrigation, wild animals would be replaced by domesticated ones, natural ecosystems would be simplified into agricultural landscapes designed for maximum human benefit. The process would take thousands of years to complete, but it began with the first agricultural settlements established by people like your group, nomads who chose permanent residence over seasonal mobility, cultivation over gathering, control over adaptation. Looking back from our modern perspective, it's easy to see the agricultural revolution as inevitable progress, as humanity's natural development from primitive hunting and gathering to advanced civilization. But the people living through it experienced it as a series of difficult choices between known traditions and uncertain innovations, between ways of life that each offered different advantages and disadvantages. The nomadic lifestyle provided freedom, flexibility, intimate knowledge of the natural world, and egalitarian social relationships. But it couldn't support large populations, couldn't accumulate resources for major projects, and was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain as environmental conditions changed and human numbers grew. Agriculture provided food security, population growth, resource accumulation, and the foundation for complex technologies and social organizations. But it required giving up mobility, accepting social hierarchies, and adopting a more adversarial relationship with the natural world. Neither choice was obviously superior to the other. Both represented sophisticated adaptations to the challenges of human survival. The triumph of agriculture wasn't inevitable. It was contingent on specific historical circumstances that made settled farming more advantageous than nomadic hunting and gathering. If the climate had remained stable, if human populations had not grown so large, if the megafauna extinctions had not occurred, nomadic lifestyles might have remained viable indefinitely. Human history might have taken a completely different course. But those circumstances did occur, and they forced choices that determined the future of our species. The last nomads of 10,000 BCE stood at the hinge point of human history. Their decisions about whether to investigate agricultural settlements or avoid them, whether to experiment with plant cultivation or stick to traditional gathering methods, whether to accept permanent residence or maintain seasonal mobility, shaped the world we live in today. Every time they chose innovation over tradition, settlement over mobility, control over adaptation, they moved humanity one step closer to the agricultural revolution that would transform our species and our planet. They couldn't have known the ultimate consequences of their choices. They were just trying to survive in a changing world, using the best information available to make decisions they hoped would benefit their children and grandchildren. But those small, pragmatic decisions accumulated across thousands of groups and hundreds of generations into the greatest transformation in human history. The world of 10,000 BCE, with its small nomadic bands and vast empty landscapes, its intimate human-nature relationships and egalitarian social structures, its detailed ecological knowledge and seasonal mobility patterns, vanished forever. In its place arose a world of permanent settlements and growing populations, of agricultural landscapes and domesticated animals, of social hierarchies and specialized occupations, of accumulated wealth and monumental architecture, the foundation for everything that followed in human history, cities and states, writing and mathematics, art and literature, science and technology, exploration and conquest, was laid by those nomadic groups who chose to experiment with agriculture in the centuries around 10,000 BCE. We are all descendants of the last nomads, products of their decisions to abandon the lifestyle that had sustained humanity since the beginning in favor of something entirely new and unprecedented. The DNA we carry contains the same sequences that allowed our ancestors to navigate across continents without maps, to identify hundreds of plant species by sight and smell, to track animals across featureless terrain, to predict weather patterns from subtle environmental cues. But we live in a world so completely transformed by agriculture and its consequences that most of us wouldn't survive a week in the environments where our ancestors thrived for hundreds of thousands of years. The skills that once defined human competence, that every adult in nomadic societies possessed as a matter of survival, have become exotic specializations practiced by tiny numbers of people in increasingly isolated contexts. We've gained enormous power over the natural world, the ability to reshape entire landscapes and ecosystems to serve human purposes. But we've lost the intimate knowledge of natural processes that once defined human consciousness. We can produce enough food to feed billions of people, but most of us don't know where our food comes from or how it's grown. We can communicate instantly with people on the other side of the planet, but many of us can't identify the plants and animals in our immediate vicinity. We've created artificial environments so completely controlled that we can live comfortably in any climate, but we've become vulnerable to disruptions in the complex systems that maintain those artificial environments. The trade-offs made by the last nomads, the choices between adaptation and control, between flexibility and security, between intimate knowledge and accumulated power, are still shaping human experience today. Understanding what life was like before the agricultural revolution isn't just an exercise in historical curiosity. It's a way of understanding alternative possibilities for human existence, ways of being human that our species practiced successfully for far longer than we've been practicing agriculture. The nomadic lifestyle wasn't primitive or backward, it was a sophisticated adaptation to the challenges of human survival that sustained our species through ice ages and climate catastrophes, that carried humans to every habitable continent, that developed the social and cognitive capabilities that would eventually make agriculture possible. The people living in 10,000 BCE weren't waiting for civilization to be invented. They were living fully human lives, rich in knowledge and relationships and meaning, adapted to environments we can barely imagine. Their world was ending, but they didn't experience it as decline or loss. They experienced it as adaptation, as response to changing conditions, as the same process of survival and innovation that had always characterized human existence. They were our ancestors, but they were also our contemporaries, people facing the same fundamental challenges of survival and meaning that every human generation faces. The specific circumstances were different, but the underlying human experiences of love and loss, hope and fear, cooperation and conflict, learning and teaching were the same. When we look back at the last nomads of 10,000 BCE, we're not looking at primitives or predecessors. We're looking at ourselves, at the human condition expressed under different circumstances, at possibilities for human existence that our species once lived and could, under different conditions, live again. The agricultural revolution that began 12,000 years ago is still continuing today. We're still working out the implications of the choice to control rather than adapt to natural processes, to accumulate rather than share resources, to live in permanent settlements rather than seasonal mobility. The problems we face today, climate change, resource depletion, social inequality, loss of biodiversity, are all consequences of the path humanity chose when the last nomads decided to become the first farmers. Understanding that choice and the world that existed before it was made might help us make better choices about the future we want to create. The last nomads of 10,000 BCE have been gone for thousands of years, but their legacy lives on in our DNA, in our capacity for adaptation and innovation, in our fundamental humanity. They were the end of one world and the beginning of another, and their story is our story, the story of humans making difficult choices about survival and meaning under changing conditions, the story of our species learning to be human in an uncertain world. The fire that warmed them during cold nights burns on in us. The knowledge they accumulated across thousands of generations informs our understanding of the world. The choices they made about how to live as humans continue to shape the choices we make today. We are all the last nomads, still traveling through an uncertain world, still adapting to changing conditions, still trying to understand what it means to be human in a world that's constantly being transformed by our presence. But let's go deeper into what that daily reality actually looked like. Because the more you understand about life in 10,000 BCE, the more remarkable the transition becomes. Picture waking up on a typical morning in late summer. You're camped near a river in what will someday be southern Germany, but right now it's a landscape that would seem completely alien to modern eyes. The forest canopy overhead is dominated by species that barely exist in Europe today. Giant aurochs, the wild ancestors of cattle, crash through the underbrush. Wolves howl in the distance, not the scattered remnants that survive in modern wilderness areas, but massive packs that follow the herds across hundreds of miles. Your camp is temporary by design, but it's not primitive. The shelters around you represent thousands of years of technological refinement. The frames are made from carefully selected wood, joined with techniques that distribute stress in ways that modern engineers would appreciate. The covering materials are processed hides that have been treated with plant-based chemicals to make them waterproof, flexible, and durable. Every tool in the camp has been crafted by someone in your group who learned the techniques from parents and grandparents going back generations. The stone axes aren't just chipped rocks. They're precision instruments made from raw materials that were traded across hundreds of miles, shaped using techniques that require years to master, hafted with wooden handles that are perfectly balanced for specific tasks. The cordage holding everything together isn't random plant fibers twisted together. It's engineered material made from specific plant species harvested at optimal times, processed using techniques that maximize strength and flexibility, twisted in patterns that prevent unraveling under stress. This is high technology adapted for nomadic life. Equipment that can be disassembled and reassembled quickly, that weighs as little as possible while maintaining maximum functionality, that can be repaired using materials available in any environment. The social organization that creates and maintains this technology is equally sophisticated. Everyone in the group has specialized knowledge, but everyone also understands the basics of every technology the group depends on. If the primary stone napper is injured or killed, 3 other people can step in and maintain tool production. If the plant specialist becomes ill, others know enough about food processing to keep the group fed. This redundancy isn't accidental. It's the result of educational systems that ensure crucial knowledge is distributed throughout the community. Children don't just learn by watching. They participate in every activity from an early age, gradually taking on more responsibility as their skills develop. By age 10, most children can identify several hundred plant species, track a dozen different animal types, predict weather patterns several days in advance, and navigate across featureless terrain using subtle environmental cues. By age 15, they're contributing adult-level labor to most group activities. By age 20, they're experts in multiple specialties. This level of universal competence is necessary because nomadic groups can't afford passengers. Everyone must contribute to survival, and everyone must be capable of stepping into multiple roles as circumstances require. But the educational process extends far beyond practical skills. Children also learn the social knowledge that holds nomadic communities together. Complex kinship systems that determine marriage possibilities across multiple groups, diplomatic protocols for interacting with strangers, conflict resolution techniques that prevent disputes from escalating to violence. Most importantly, they learn the vast oral literature that preserves crucial information across generations. Not just practical knowledge about where to find resources, but historical knowledge about past climate patterns, legendary accounts of successful survival strategies, philosophical frameworks for understanding human relationships with the natural world. These oral traditions are humanity's first libraries, information storage systems that preserve knowledge across centuries without any written records. The precision with which information is transmitted is remarkable. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers have found that crucial survival information can be passed down through dozens of generations with minimal distortion. The secret is repetition and social verification. Important information is shared frequently in multiple contexts by multiple people. Children hear the same crucial knowledge from parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and family friends. Stories are told and retold, with listeners correcting errors and adding details. By the time information has been integrated into a group's oral tradition, it has been tested against the experience of hundreds of individuals across multiple generations. It represents a form of collective intelligence that modern societies struggle to replicate. This morning, as your group prepares for another day of seasonal movement, that collective intelligence is being applied to reading environmental conditions and planning the day's activities. The older members of the group are interpreting subtle signs that would be invisible to modern people, wind patterns that indicate weather changes days in advance, animal behaviors that reveal the location of water sources miles away, plant conditions that suggest the optimal timing for moving to different resource areas. The youngest adult in the group, a woman who has been tracking a particular deer herd for several days, reports that the animals have changed their movement patterns in ways that might indicate the presence of predators. This isn't casual observation. She's been following specific individuals, noting their feeding times, their preferred routes between water and shelter, their response to various disturbances. Her tracking skills represent knowledge that took years to develop and would be nearly impossible for modern people to acquire. She can identify individual animals by their tracks, determine their age and health from their droppings, predict their behavior based on seasonal patterns and current conditions. More importantly, she understands these animals not as resources to be exploited, but as participants in complex ecological relationships that humans must navigate carefully. Overhunting in one area doesn't just reduce future hunting opportunities. It disrupts predator-prey relationships, alters plant growth patterns, affects water quality, and creates cascading changes throughout the local ecosystem. The sustainable hunting practices that nomadic groups developed weren't based on modern conservation science. They were based on thousands of years of experience with the consequences of overexploitation. Groups that hunted too intensively in their territories faced resource depletion that could threaten their survival. Those that developed sustainable practices thrived over multiple generations. This experiential knowledge created hunting protocols that modern wildlife managers would recognize as sophisticated resource management, rotating hunting pressure between different areas to allow animal populations to recover, targeting specific age and sex classes to minimize impact on breeding populations, timing hunts to coincide with natural population cycles. But these weren't formal policies imposed by authorities. They were cultural practices that emerged organically from the collective experience of successful groups. Everyone understood the principles because everyone had observed the consequences of violating them. The Deer Trackers report this morning triggers a group discussion about hunting strategies that demonstrates this collective decision-making process in action. The presence of predators following the deer herd creates both opportunities and risks that must be carefully evaluated. Predators make hunting more dangerous, but they also make it potentially more rewarding. Wolves and other carnivores often wound prey animals that escape but are weakened enough for human hunters to catch. Following predator packs can lead to fresh kills that human groups can scavenge, obtaining meat without the risks and energy expenditure of hunting. But predators also compete directly with humans for the same resources. A pack of wolves can consume an entire deer carcass in hours, leaving nothing for human scavengers. Worse, large predators view humans as competitors and will defend their kills aggressively. The discussion that follows weighs these factors against the group's current resource needs, their knowledge of alternative hunting opportunities, and their assessment of the specific predators involved. The process looks casual to outside observers. People sitting around the fire, sharing observations, offering opinions, gradually reaching consensus. But it's actually a sophisticated form of collective intelligence that synthesizes information from multiple sources and experiences to produce decisions that no individual could make alone. Everyone's input is valued because everyone has different knowledge and perspectives. The youngest adults are most familiar with current animal movements and resource conditions. The oldest adults have the most experience with predator behavior and climate patterns. Middle-aged adults have the best understanding of group capabilities and resource needs. Women and men often have different specialties and offer different perspectives on the same problems. Children contribute observations that adults might miss because they're paying attention to different aspects of the environment. The consensus that emerges isn't the lowest common denominator of everyone's opinions. It's a synthesis that takes into account all available information and produces strategies that are more sophisticated than any individual could develop. This morning, the group decides to parallel the deer herd at a distance, monitoring both the animals and their predator followers while remaining ready to take advantage of opportunities that arise. It's a complex strategy that requires coordination between multiple hunters, careful navigation to maintain optimal positioning, and constant communication to adjust tactics as conditions change. The decision-making process takes less than an hour, but it draws on knowledge accumulated over generations and demonstrates problem-solving capabilities that rival those of modern organizations with far more resources and formal structures. As the hunting party departs, the remaining group members begin their own complex activities. The plant specialists start processing materials gathered over the previous several days, using techniques that transform raw resources into forms suitable for storage and transport. Nuts are being cracked and sorted, with the meat separated from shells that will be used for other purposes. Roots are being cleaned and dried, prepared for consumption during travel when fresh resources aren't available. Fibers are being extracted from plant materials and prepared for cordage production. Each of these activities requires specialized knowledge and equipment. The nut processing uses stone tools shaped for specific tasks, wooden mortars carved to optimal dimensions, baskets woven in patterns that facilitate sorting and cleaning. The techniques have been refined over thousands of years to maximize efficiency and minimize waste. But the work isn't just practical, it's also social and educational. Adults work together in small groups, sharing techniques and information while accomplishing necessary tasks. Children observe and participate at levels appropriate to their age and skill. Stories are told, jokes are shared, social relationships are maintained and strengthened. This integration of work, education, and social interaction is one of the defining characteristics of hunter-gatherer societies. There's no separation between productive activities and community life, between learning and living, between work and play. Children learn by participating in real activities that contribute to group survival. Adults teach by including children in their work and sharing their knowledge during routine activities. Social relationships are maintained through shared labor and common purposes. The result is a form of social organization that modern societies struggle to replicate. Work is meaningful because it directly supports the survival and well-being of people you know and care about. Learning is relevant because it prepares you for activities you'll actually perform. Social relationships are functional because they're based on mutual interdependence and shared experiences. But this social organization also imposes constraints that modern people would find difficult to accept. Individual autonomy is limited by group needs and consensus decision-making processes. Privacy is minimal in small communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. Personal accumulation of resources is discouraged in favor of sharing and reciprocity. The balance between individual freedom and group solidarity that hunter-gatherer societies achieved worked well for small nomadic communities, but it doesn't scale easily to larger populations or more complex economic systems. As the day progresses, your group faces the kind of unexpected challenge that tests the resilience of nomadic social organization. The hunting party returns early with disturbing news. They've encountered signs of another human group in the area, people whose identity and intentions are unknown. In the modern world, encountering strangers is routine and usually harmless. In the nomadic world of 10,000 BCE, unknown humans represent one of the most serious threats any group can face. Other human groups compete for the same resources. They may carry diseases that your group has no resistance to. They may have hostile intentions, seeking to drive your people out of good hunting territories or to take revenge for past conflicts. But they also represent opportunities. They may be potential trading partners carrying valuable materials from distant regions. They may have information about resource conditions in areas your group is planning to visit. They may be seeking peaceful relationships that could benefit both communities. The challenge is determining which scenario applies before committing to a course of action that could have fatal consequences if wrong. The protocols that nomadic groups developed for managing encounters with strangers demonstrate the sophisticated risk assessment capabilities that small-scale societies can achieve. The process begins with gathering as much information as possible before any direct contact occurs. The hunters who discovered the signs return to conduct more detailed reconnaissance. How many people are in the unknown group? What kind of equipment do they have? Are they traveling or camped? Do their tracks suggest they're hunting, trading, or moving through the area for other purposes? Most importantly, do any group members recognize signs that might indicate the stranger's identity or origins? Tool technologies, travel patterns, and camp organization often provide clues about which group strangers belong to and whether previous relationships exist. This information gathering takes hours and involves risks of its own. Getting close enough to observe strangers without being detected requires exceptional stealth skills. If the reconnaissance is discovered, it could precipitate exactly the kind of hostile encounter the group is trying to avoid. But the information is essential for making good decisions. The difference between approaching potential allies and approaching potential enemies could determine the survival of everyone in the group. By evening, enough information has been gathered to begin planning a response. The unknown group appears to be a small hunting party, probably from a larger community located elsewhere. Their equipment and travel patterns suggest they're from a group your people have encountered before, though not recently. Previous interactions with this group were neutral to positive. No major conflicts, some limited trading, general adherence to the territorial protocols that govern movement through contested areas. But that was several years ago, and conditions may have changed. Leadership in nomadic groups can shift when older members die or younger ones mature. Resource pressures can turn previously friendly groups into competitors. Past misunderstandings can escalate into active hostility. The group decides to attempt peaceful contact, but with extensive precautions. Only the most experienced diplomats will approach the strangers, and only after careful preparation and positioning that allows for rapid retreat if negotiations go wrong. The diplomatic protocols that govern these encounters represent thousands of years of trial and error in managing intergroup relationships. Specific signals indicate peaceful intentions. Particular gifts demonstrate respect and reciprocity. Formal verbal formulas establish the framework for negotiation. The first contact occurs the next morning with elaborate rituals designed to minimize the risk of misunderstanding. The diplomats approach slowly and openly, hands visible, carrying gifts rather than weapons. They announce their group's identity and peaceful intentions using formulas that have been standardized across multiple communities. The response from the strangers indicates that they recognize the protocols and are willing to engage in formal negotiations. Over the next several hours, through careful questioning and information exchange, the two groups establish each other's current status and intentions. The strangers are indeed from a group your people know, but they're operating under new leadership and facing resource pressures that have forced them to expand their hunting territories. They're not immediately hostile, but they're concerned about competition for resources and uncertain about your group's intentions. The negotiations that follow demonstrate the sophisticated conflict resolution capabilities that nomadic societies developed to manage resource competition without resorting to violence. Both groups have legitimate needs for access to local resources. Neither has exclusive claims to the territory, which has been used by multiple groups for generations. The challenge is finding a solution that meets everyone's needs without creating precedents that might encourage future conflicts. The solution that emerges involves temporal and spatial divisions of resource access. Your group will hunt in the western areas while the strangers hunt in the eastern areas. Both groups will avoid the central region for several days, allowing animal populations to settle after recent disturbances. More importantly, both groups will coordinate their future movements to minimize conflicts and maximize opportunities for mutually beneficial interactions. Information about resource conditions will be shared. Plans for major hunting activities will be communicated in advance. Opportunities for trading and social exchange will be arranged. This isn't a formal treaty in the modern sense. There's no enforcement mechanism beyond mutual self-interest and community pressure, but it's a sophisticated agreement that addresses complex resource management issues while maintaining relationships that both groups need for long-term survival. The process of reaching this agreement takes most of a day and demonstrates capabilities that modern international relations specialists would recognize as advanced diplomacy. Multiple interests are balanced, creative solutions are developed for seemingly incompatible needs, future relationships are structured to prevent similar conflicts. Most remarkably, the entire process occurs between groups that had no prior warning they would encounter each other and no formal institutional framework for managing the interaction. The success of these negotiations reflects the social capital that nomadic communities invested in maintaining intergroup relationships. Everyone in both groups understood the protocols because managing stranger encounters was a crucial survival skill. Everyone had participated in similar negotiations before and understood how to contribute constructively to the process. The resolution also reflects the ecological knowledge that both groups possessed. They understood the carrying capacity of local resources well enough to develop sharing arrangements that wouldn't lead to overexploitation. They had enough experience with animal behavior to know how their activities would affect each other's hunting success. But most importantly, both groups understood that long-term survival depended on maintaining relationships with neighbors rather than eliminating competitors. In a world where unexpected disasters could devastate any group, having allies who might provide assistance during emergencies was more valuable than having exclusive access to particular resources. The stranger encounter resolves peacefully, but it illustrates the constant challenges that nomadic groups faced in managing relationships across the complex social landscapes they inhabited. Every territory was used by multiple groups. Every resource was claimed by several communities. Every movement brought the possibility of encounters that could lead to conflict, cooperation, or something in between. Managing these relationships required social skills, diplomatic capabilities, and ecological knowledge that few modern people possess. It also required a form of risk assessment that constantly balanced the potential benefits of cooperation against the dangers of exploitation. The groups that succeeded in this environment were those that developed the most sophisticated capabilities for managing intergroup relationships. They understood how to signal peaceful intentions, how to negotiate resource-sharing arrangements, how to build alliances that provided mutual benefits, and how to resolve conflicts before they escalated to violence. But they also understood when cooperation wasn't possible and how to defend themselves when peaceful solutions failed. The archaeological record from this period shows that nomadic groups were capable of devastating warfare when their survival was threatened. The balance between cooperation and competition that characterized relationships between nomadic groups was one of the defining features of the pre-agricultural world. It created social pressures that rewarded intelligence, communication skills, and strategic thinking while punishing groups that were either too aggressive or too passive. These pressures shaped human evolution in ways that are still visible today. Our capacity for complex social reasoning, our ability to form coalitions with strangers, our sensitivity to fairness and reciprocity all reflect adaptations to the challenges of managing intergroup relationships in nomadic societies. As your group continues its seasonal movements over the following weeks, they encounter evidence of the larger changes that are beginning to transform the nomadic world. Game trails that have been used for thousands of years are empty. Water sources that previous generations relied on have dried up. Plant communities are shifting in response to changing climate conditions, with some species becoming more abundant while others disappear entirely. Most significantly, they encounter increasing numbers of abandoned campsites, evidence that other nomadic groups are either changing their movement patterns or disappearing entirely. Some of these changes reflect natural processes that nomadic groups have always adapted to. Climate fluctuations, animal population cycles, and resource variability have been constant features of the nomadic world. Successful groups learned to adjust their strategies as conditions changed, but the scope and pace of current changes suggests something more fundamental is happening. The entire ecological foundation that has supported nomadic life for hundreds of thousands of years is being transformed. The megafauna extinctions that began during the late Pleistocene are accelerating. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, cave bears, and dozens of other large species are disappearing from landscapes where they've been abundant for thousands of years. These extinctions aren't just reducing the availability of large game, they're disrupting entire ecological communities. Predator populations that depended on megafauna are collapsing. Plant communities that were shaped by large herbivore grazing are changing. Water sources that were maintained by animal activity are disappearing. The climate changes that began with the end of the last ice age are also accelerating. Rising temperatures are altering precipitation patterns, changing the timing of seasonal cycles, and shifting the geographic ranges of plant and animal species. Forest communities are expanding into former grasslands, while grasslands are expanding into former deserts. Animal migration routes are shifting as the resources they connect change location or disappear entirely. For nomadic groups, these changes create unprecedented challenges. Traditional knowledge about where to find resources during different seasons becomes unreliable when resource locations are constantly shifting. Social relationships based on predictable movement patterns are disrupted when groups are forced to alter their territorial ranges. Most fundamentally, the ecological stability that made nomadic life possible is disappearing. The complex relationships between climate, resources, and human populations that had been refined over thousands of years are being disrupted faster than cultural adaptation can keep pace. Your group's response to these challenges follows patterns that are being repeated by nomadic communities across the world. Traditional strategies are maintained when possible, but modified when necessary. New opportunities are explored cautiously while fallback options are preserved. The most significant modification involves increased cooperation with settled agricultural communities. What had started as occasional trade relationships are becoming systematic economic partnerships. The agricultural settlements can provide stored food during periods when hunting and gathering yields are inadequate. They can offer temporary residence when nomadic territories become unproductive. They can supply materials and tools that nomadic groups no longer have reliable access to. In exchange, nomadic groups provide services that settled communities need but can't produce themselves. They serve as long-distance traders, carrying goods and information across territories that agricultural peoples can't easily access. They provide specialized hunting skills that can supplement agricultural food production. They offer military services that help protect agricultural settlements from hostile groups. These economic relationships are gradually evolving into something more complex than simple exchange. Nomadic groups are spending longer periods associated with agricultural settlements. Some group members are learning agricultural techniques, while others maintain traditional nomadic skills. Children are growing up with exposure to both lifestyles, becoming bicultural in ways that previous generations never experienced. They learn to hunt and gather from nomadic relatives while also learning to cultivate and store food from agricultural communities. This bicultural generation will be crucial to the transition from nomadic to agricultural life. They understand both systems from personal experience rather than second-hand observation. They can evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of each lifestyle based on direct participation rather than cultural prejudice. Most importantly, they can envision forms of economic and social organization that combine elements of both systems in ways that previous generations might not have considered. The final transition, when it comes, doesn't feel like a dramatic break with the past. It feels like a logical extension of adaptations that have been developing for years. Your group's children, now young adults, are more comfortable with agricultural activities than their parents. They understand plant cultivation, food storage, and permanent construction techniques that older group members struggle with. When the opportunity arises to establish a permanent settlement in a location that offers both agricultural potential and access to traditional hunting and gathering resources, it's the young adults who advocate most strongly for making the change. Their arguments focus on practical advantages rather than philosophical preferences. Agricultural production can provide food security that hunting and gathering can no longer guarantee. Permanent settlement allows for the accumulation of tools and materials that nomadic life can't support. Larger communities can provide better protection against the increasing violence that's affecting nomadic territories. But they also argue for maintaining connections to nomadic traditions and skills. The settlement should be located where seasonal hunting and gathering can supplement agricultural production. Group members should maintain the mobility and environmental knowledge that might be essential if agricultural systems fail. The solution they propose isn't pure agriculture or pure nomadism, but a mixed system that combines the advantages of both approaches while minimizing the disadvantages of either. This mixed strategy proves to be remarkably successful. The combination of stored agricultural products and seasonal wild resources provides more reliable food security than either strategy alone. The ability to shift emphasis between settlement and mobility allows the group to adapt to changing conditions more effectively than purely nomadic or purely agricultural communities. Most importantly, the mixed strategy allows the group to maintain their cultural identity while adapting to new circumstances. They remain recognizably the same people who had lived as nomads for thousands of years, but they've successfully integrated new capabilities that enable them to thrive in a changing world. The transition from nomadic to settled life, when viewed from this perspective, doesn't represent the abandonment of human nature or the loss of authentic ways of living. It represents the same process of cultural adaptation that had always characterized successful human communities. The last nomads weren't primitive peoples who were replaced by more advanced civilizations. They were sophisticated societies that successfully adapted to changing circumstances by developing new forms of social and economic organization. Their descendants didn't lose the knowledge and capabilities that had sustained nomadic life for hundreds of thousands of years. They incorporated that knowledge into more complex systems that could address the challenges of life in a transformed world. We are all descendants of the last nomads, carriers of their adaptive capabilities and inheritors of their legacy of successful cultural innovation. The world they created through their choices about how to respond to unprecedented challenges became the foundation for everything that followed in human history. Understanding their story isn't just an exercise in historical curiosity, it's a way of understanding our own adaptive capabilities, our own potential for creating innovative responses to the challenges we face in our rapidly changing world.